Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. And I am here with Dr. Owen Rees. And I've actually engaged with him for a while. We'll talk about why. He runs a website called Bad Ancient, which is involved in sort of debunking um, false myths, rumors, etc., about the ancient world. And so,
Misconceptions as well.
misconceptions, yeah, exactly, that kind of stuff. And it's not always misinformation, though some of it is. And at the same time, he also has a really cool new book coming out called The Far Edges of the Known World. And it's a new history of the ancient past. And that it comes out tomorrow, right?
Yeah, in the UK, I think it's in the fall for the American market. But yeah, in
Okay.
the UK, it's out tomorrow.
So it's out tomorrow in the UK, and it'll be out in what, 8, 9 months in the US,
Yeah,
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
Yeah, so it's something to look forward to. I've been reading through parts of it. I haven't gotten through it all yet, but it's a phenomenal book and very well
Thank you.
written. And it's something that I think people crave. It's something that I've noticed just from chatting with people in our community. As I was telling you beforehand, we have a video coming out in the next week or two, an interview with YouTuber Raven De Silva, and she published a similar book. Here, wait, let's first show your book. I got to do that, don't I? So wait a second. Sorry to cut off. This is Owen's book here, The Far Edges of the Known World, and it's published in the UK by Bloomsbury. And then, yeah, so I've also done an interview on a similar book, and it is called The Other Ancient Civilizations. And so there's this trend, I think, where we've all heard a lot about the same 10 civilizations or societies in history, and people are craving to understand kind of what else is going on besides that core perspective that we all get in school of ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt and things like that. So was that kind of your motivation for writing your book on the edges of the known world?
To an extent, yeah. Well, I think for the past 20 plus years, we've had such a fantastic series of ancient history and archaeologically focused books aimed at the public come out. I think we're now at a point where people who are consuming ancient history of all ages, their level of understanding is now a lot higher than it was 40 years ago. Just the general, I don't know, comfortability with the ancient world to discuss it, to discuss Rome, to discuss Greece. This is quite a normal thing to be able to talk about. You obviously had the ridiculous trend of how often you think about the Roman Empire.
Apparently, lots of guys are thinking about
Lots
the
of
Roman
guys,
Empire
they're
all the
clearly
time.
comfortable with it. So you're like, okay, if you know the Roman Empire, that what else would you like to know about? And I was same as you. I find talking to people, both within the communities of sort of history reading and the love of history and watching history, but also just generally, like I'm a university lecturer, so in my classroom, I teach a lot of non-historians, and even then, you start talking about ancient history, they have questions, and they're very rarely about Greece and Rome. As much. And I think there is just this sort of inquisitive nature now. So what else is going on? What else is going on in the world? I always remember a conversation with my dad, of all people, who asked at one point, okay, so this is going on in Rome, but how does that tie in with China? Like, what's going on in China at this point? What's going on in India at this point? So, even just those large modern global powers, kind of attract that same question. We're within Europe, this is going, okay, brilliant. So what's going on in Asia? What's going on in certain areas of Africa? What's going on in Central America at this point? Where are we on that timeline? So it very much came from that, and in part my Bad Ancient website. So the Bad Ancient website is, yeah. I appreciate that, Flint. The Bad Ancient website is we sell it as like a fact-checking website, but it is as much about exploring people's questions. So people ask us questions about ancient history that they may have heard, maybe seen on a documentary, maybe a teacher mentioned something, and they want to know, is there any truth to it? And we don't take the perspective of aggressive debunking. Not for this website. So we literally go into the evidence. So, okay, what does the evidence actually say? And if we can't find any evidence, what does the scholarship say? Like, where has this idea even come from? So that's the kind of educational foundation to this. So the book was almost driven by a similar thing, which is how much of the ancient world, how much of ancient history is drawn from a very narrow focus, and just how audacious can I be to widen that focus? Which is what I try to do, which is why it covers so much of a geographic and a chronological span. It covers over like 6,000 years, technically. Not all in thorough detail, I should point out. That's not the point. It's about using sort of case studies and examples to talk about things.
Yeah, the
But
chapters are
geographically,
organized by places that you go. Like, I think it's 3
precisely.
chapters with 3 different places per section?
Yeah, roughly, except for
Yeah.
the end. So at the end, I move out of the idea of Europe and the Mediterranean basin and things like that, and I just go, right, let's just get out of what we might call the classical world, so the world of Greece, Rome. Let's get out of that entirely. Let's start looking at Ukraine. Let's start looking at Pakistan. Let's start looking at Vietnam, one of my personal favorites to sneak into this book.
I was actually surprised you didn't put in the Americas in that last section.
Do you know, it was debated between me and my editor, me and my agent, me and a lot of people, about whether or not to fit the Americas in. And basically, it was a matter of space. That's all it really came down to. And to tackle the Americas within it would have taken out a narrative thread from the book, which is about our understanding of, ultimately, our understanding of European ancient history and how it's skewed by our focus. There, you certainly could do the Americas, and I have plans.
Yeah, no, and I think, in fact, we have a comment in the chat from Sabine. She mentions, I have indeed often been wondering about the other continents. Whenever we were studying Rome and Greece, even French history tends to start when Julius Caesar arrives. And so this is kind of the issue, is like the way history is often taught, especially at, like, you know, pre-university level. But even at many universities,
even at university level, that's not.
It'll vary from university to university and what's going on. But it's interesting how it really does start from that core basis. You don't start with French history until the Romans interact with the Gauls. And so it's like, it has this totally skewed bias. And so I don't know, what do we do about that? Because, I mean, obviously you write a book on it, but, you know, reading this book, we were chatting about this earlier, from the perspective of an archaeologist, I actually found your approach to be a little jarring at times, because you're writing at it from the point of view of a historian, which means you're writing at it from the point of view of written history and text, but you're trying to engage with places where they don't have as many texts, or most of the descriptions of them textually are from that core area.
From the external,
And so, what was your thoughts on how to address that kind of bias, let's say?
Well, my first thought when doing this was, I bet this is going to really annoy Flint.
I'm sure it was, yeah.
No, to be honest, the reason why I went to these sites, the reason why I picked these so many of these examples, is because it challenged the dominance of written histories. It challenged the let's go to Herodotus, let's go to Thucydides, and let's trust them. And so something that comes up a few times in the book is actually, what do our written sources say about this place versus what does the archaeology suggest about this place? And to kind of show and highlight the just what's going on. And of course, archaeology still has its limitations, especially when you're trying to build narratives.
Yeah, of course.
Which, of course, most archaeologists aren't really trying to do. That's not the core element of archaeology. But in history, it kind of is. Like, without a narrative to hang this together, you got to ask the question: what's a historian trying to achieve?
I mean, there is social history, which has less of that kind of narrative building, where you're thinking about demography and daily life and different sorts of things. And
Agreed.
I mean,
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that.
In general, is still trying to think about change over time, oftentimes. So there is that sense of a narrative, but it obviously is not the, like, personal narrative of this ruler did that, this war happened, and you know, that kind of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. So what you're trying to do is, as a historian, is just grab all the eclectic evidence and trying to see what you're looking at. So whilst each of the chapters builds through narratives and stories that I found really interesting, what often you'll find is they don't necessarily link chronologically.
Yeah.
And I even say at the beginning of the book, this is not a chronological book. You know, I'm not building a narrative here that you can follow to understand human history,
Mhm, mhm,
because that, I mean, ultimately, I don't think that can be done. I think you end up cherry picking too much
mhm,
in book form. So what I wanted to do instead is to kind of expand our understanding of the ancient world. So we understand the you know the basic premises of Roman civilization or society, or it's democracy and then it's imperialism and all this kind of stuff, or Greece or Egypt or whatever it be. I wanted to think, oh, well, can we expand that to understand it more? So a classic example is in terms of culture. Um, Ancient Greece has this really clear distinction. Greek writers make a clear distinction between the idea of being Greek and not being Greek. The idea of the barbaroi, the foreign speaker.
yeah, of course.
Right? Whilst barbarian in Greek doesn't hold all the negative connotations we have now. That comes more as it comes through the Roman traditions as well. That's when it really picks up the idea of savagery and chaos. The Greeks do still very much see them as other, see them as lesser in a hierarchy. There is this kind of looking down on them.
Mhm,
And what I loved in exploring the three sites I look at a site in southern France in what is now Marseille. I look at a place called Olbia, which is right next to Crimea, and Naucratis, which is in Egypt.
mhm.
So you've got the Greeks being Greek away from Greece. And what I found in each of these examples was away from the prying eyes of judgmental center people, your Platos, your Aristotles, and things like this. The idea of the barbarian starts to not disappear, but kind of blend with acceptable Greek action and behavior. So we see intermarriage, we see friendships form, we see a trust and a bond and an interchange of not just ideas, but also like culture. And
Yeah.
it's just an amazing thing to see. And if you only read Plato, you would not think this could really happen, or if it did happen, it was bad.
Or if it did happen, it just came from Egypt.
Yeah,
In a
yeah.
sense,
He does like to say
from
everything's
other
the Egyptians.
cultures that were considered civilized,
Yeah.
let's say. And, you know, that maybe I missed it, maybe it's later in a section I did not get to, but one of my issues, and I bring this up a lot because I talk with pseudoscientists
Mhm,
about things like a lost civilization.
mhm.
And so this entire point here, it really stresses to me why we don't usually use the term civilization anymore, because the entire connotation is that there's a civilized group and an uncivilized group,
Yeah,
and you draw this kind of value judgment.
yeah.
And so, but the reality when you look at things archaeologically, of course, I mean, and I've worked in places very close to where you went in the book, so
Mm.
not the exact sites, but I've worked at Chersonesos in the Crimea. I worked there for 3 summers. That was one of the
Yep.
first projects I ever worked on, the first
Wow.
Greek project I ever worked on back like 25 years ago. And then, yeah, and
You
then more
betray your age, Flint.
and then well, I was quite young when I was there, but yes, it was 25 years ago. No, well, it was 23 22 years ago, I guess it
Okay.
was when I was there, the first time. I worked there for 3 summers, and I have a nice Twitter thread on the Archaeology
Yeah.
Ukraine. We helped raise funds for the journal Archaeologia, which was under threat of being canceled with the invasion. And so we were able to raise enough funds so that they could transition to digital publications, which
Mm.
was a big help. And then I also more recently I work in Romania at Histria, and so
Ooh.
and not too far. I forget which site you were at. You were at Thomas, right? Yeah,
Thomas, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so not too far from there, and
No,
right
and
on
it
the
has
Black Sea.
connections with Olbia as well. There's a connection
Yeah.
via a family. I forget which. But yeah, so very interconnected, very relevant to many of the places I talked about.
Yeah, exactly. And so working on these edges and doing excavations of cemeteries and then houses and things like that, you very clearly see this kind of uh, cultural exchange, right? You
Yeah.
know, the people get along. you start seeing, what chapter was it you were mentioning? The chapter on Nubia, where one of the forts, they're still using they're using local
Yeah.
cookpots, and so therefore they're eating local style cuisine. But in other ways, they're more Egyptian, and
Yeah.
so we see this all the time. This is very common, where you see this Greek city state in this is Egypt to Greece, but whatever. You see a Greek city state somewhere that's on the edges of the world, of their known world, let's say, and then they have kind of the Greek things, like some temples and some,
Mm.
not an amphitheater, a theater and things
Mhm.
like that, but they're using local cookware. And so that's such a common sort of thing to see. And their day-to-day life has that kind of engagement with local culture, while their kind of big, showy stuff is very Hellenified, Greekified,
Yeah.
let's say. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the narrative on civilization over culture. I mean, I'm even happy to talk about overbearing and dominant cultures and things like that. But the idea of civilization creates this narrative of almost cultural silos,
Mhm.
where I think one of the classics, isn't it, is the idea of the Romans and Romanization, the old argument that the Romans come in and basically enforce Roman life, Roman language, and everything on a place. And all the archaeology over the past century has constantly proven this to be wrong.
Oh, yeah.
So it's but it is that. I mean, there is interchange and there is blending and there is merging, but it quite often happens most at the edge of the world, or the edge of what these cultures would have considered the world. And ultimately, I spent a lot of time thinking why this is, and ultimately, it's just because that's where these things are crossing. If you think about it in terms of like, they're not boundaries, but if you think about it, living at a boundary of a cultural sphere next to another one, if something's coming through, it's coming through that boundary, and if you've got people living there, they're absorbing that, and
Yeah.
that's where, most interestingly, each of these examples in my book, that's where innovation happens. And it's because of this cultural, no, not cultural blending, but actually this desire to get along because they have to live next to each other.
Yeah, and I think they learn from one another. I mean, one of the biggest critiques these days of Romanization is sort of, it's not just a one-way street. It isn't
Yeah.
just people at the edges of the Roman Empire becoming Roman. It is ideas and concepts, whole religious cults,
Mm.
being brought back to the center as well, to
Yeah.
Rome and things like that.
But if you notice it, Flint, and people will spot this now if you haven't before, the Romans don't adopt. They don't adopt religion; they steal it. There's not syncretism when Christianity or Rome is involved. It's they take it. So again, it's that idea of power.
Mhm,
Whereas
mhm.
ultimately, you're absolutely right. All we're seeing is the same thing going in the other direction. This one of the most interesting areas that I found researching this book on this, because the research is kind of happening now, is trying to look at, for a few decades, there's been a good understanding of how Greek culture kind of entered India
Mhm.
and the sort of influences of Greek philosophy, but also art and all these various things, and how it may have influenced, in particular, Buddhist history and Buddhist traditions, as well as other Indian traditions as well. But what has been happening more recently is they're starting to explore it going the other way
Yeah.
and asking this question of, well, hold on, if it's going one way, surely it's kind of going the other way. And I touch on this in the book, not with the philosophy and that, because I'm still, shall I say, I'm still waiting for the research to come to more of a
To
uh,
gel.
to gel on it. But in terms of the presence of Buddhists in the ancient Mediterranean is just fascinating.
Yeah.
So there's just like little stories here and there. There's it's not a lovely story, it's a horrific story of a Buddhist monk setting himself on fire in Athens during the time of Augustus. And the people of Athens then build him basically a tomb and an inscription that declares him immortal according to Indian custom. So not
Okay.
Greek custom, but they were like, we accept according to your custom. You are immortalized by this. And we also have like snippets of possible Buddhists in being mentioned in Alexandria and places like this. And it's probably 2 years now. I think it was about
I did
2
not
years
notice that.
ago. They've uncovered a Buddhist statue, or statue of Buddha, at Berenike.
Oh, I do remember seeing that. Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
So now we have
Yeah.
not only the textual evidence where we're all like, oh, that's interesting, I wonder what that's about. We now actually have that kind of clear-cut proof of at least one Buddhist person giving an offering to a that's the one, the Berenike
Yeah,
Buddha.
Veronica Buddha. Yeah, exactly.
I think it's in the
Yeah.
temple of, is it Temple of Isis? Does it say
Yeah,
where it was
Isis.
found?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the forecourt of an early Roman period temple dedicated to the goddess of Isis.
So
Yeah,
just
exactly.
to kind of sum up like how we're talking about such an interconnected world, we have a statue of Buddha brought presumably by either a trader or someone living in and around Berenike, which is on the Red Sea in Egypt, but is actually a Roman town.
Hmm.
And people want me to talk about, or people want historians, or they want us to talk about these things as if it's just Rome and the Roman Empire, or Egypt and Egyptian culture. And you're like, but it's not. It's everything at once. Like
Yeah,
all of this.
exactly. And that's the point that's so tough to get across sometimes. It's why I don't like historians that create these grand narratives, or
Oh,
some archaeologists that create grand narratives as well, because it's just like, look, whenever you start creating a grand narrative, you're shoehorning everything in. And it's like, that does not account for all the nuance and
no.
complexity that we have. You need to create a narrative that somehow accounts for that, and that's just impossible if you're trying to create a direct line.
Yeah.
And so, even I'd like to challenge you on something you said earlier, where you look for this area at the very far edges of these worlds, and that's where you find this kind of diversity and this exchange going on. But part of the issue I see as an archaeologist and thinking about how things change over time is those edges shift and change with time. So the edge of the Roman world obviously is different in the 3rd century AD than
Yeah.
the 3rd century BC. And so, the Greek world as well, you could think about, you mentioned now Kratos and Egypt, and you could think about, the Greeks in Egypt and the Romans in Egypt. And I mean, even at the time of Cleopatra, where, it's obviously a very much a Greek state, let's say, the ways, we had this big discussion online about how Cleopatra is depicted in the media.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, the way Cleopatra's statues are depicted inside and outside of Egypt are depicted for different audiences, because there's different goals and different people that are trying to be portrayed to. So, you have very Egyptian, African looking Cleopatra statues in Egypt, but then you have very Greek, Roman statues types of Cleopatra outside of Egypt. And so, how we define these edges is also interesting,
Yeah.
if you see what I mean.
It absolutely is, and you're spot on there. And a couple of the chapters has to engage with this problem, where all of a sudden a town that I'm covering in as much detail as the evidence allows suddenly falls out of the Roman Empire because the barriers have moved, or is no longer under Greek influence. It's now dealing with Julius Caesar at the door, or and all these different things. And it just makes the murkiness more interesting. Well, other way around, I think murkiness makes these places more interesting as a result, because very few people's lives are static, very few towns' lives are static, and there is no sort of sense of this is now how it is for this place. Even the biggest cities, like even when we talk about Rome, talk about Athens, talk about Alexandria and things like that, it's never that simple. There's always more going on as time goes passes. So I would agree with you there. What we see at the outer edges of these worlds, which I'll get to in a minute, don't worry, Flint. What we see at the outer edges is the distinction is so much clearer and so more it's more stark. And in terms of narrative, in terms of storytelling, in terms of seeing these shifts regularly occurring, it is at the outer edges that is most apparent. Now, in terms of what do you mean by the edge?
I'm not following. Explain what you mean. The outer edges of these sort of cultural spheres,
That's
where
right,
there's
yeah.
a sharper distinction between one culture and another?
What we're seeing is actually the opposite at the outer edges. We're seeing that.
Yeah, that's what I thought you were describing.
That's what we're getting at. That's what we're getting at, Flint.
Okay.
So, in terms of what do we actually mean by the outer edge? You're right. So we've got this idea of a cultural sphere. So with something like Rome, the easiest thing to kind of visualize is the horrific red on a map. Where they build the Roman Empire out on a map and it creates this static image. But But ultimately, what the book does, what historians try and do, is align that with how the writers within Roman culture, Greek culture, whichever it is, how they're talking about the rest of the world. So one of my favorite examples from this is the earliest sources we have that talk about Britain. So you've got the Greek sources who aren't even convinced it's real. Because
I'm not convinced it's real, and I live it.
Perpetual winter, I'm afraid, mate. So you got once Pytheas alleged to have found it or sort of circumnavigated it along his greater journey north, many writers just assumed he made it up. So you've got this real disagreement with, is Britain even real? Is it possible a place can be this horrific? He describes it as very cold, very wet, and all that kind of thing. And then it moves forward, when the Romans interact with it a bit more, and it is literally described as the very edge of the world. And it's the idea of humanity could not possibly live any further away than that. That's probably the furthest humans could be. And so whilst I accept that, the edges is all very hypothetical, and it is culturally determined, that was the reason why it was important in the book to kind of look at different cultural spheres, to show these edges as being slightly different and to show them as moving and show them as varied. And it's also a reason why I put in some of the examples, some of the chapters in the book also challenge our idea of the edge of the world in the ancient world. One of my personal favorites of this is Aksum in Ethiopia. In which I literally get towards the end of it, and I tell this sort of potted history of Aksum and what's going on and how it interrelates with the trade networks I've been covering throughout the book, and actually what's going on in Aksum within Christian tradition and Islamic tradition and all these things. And I'm like, why don't we talk about this place more?
It's super interesting. Yeah. In fact, we had a postdoc here at Cardiff give an interesting talk on kind of considering that entire region. So Aksum, but Nubia as well, that larger sort of area, and the way it engages with, areas to the north and to the south. It could be, it maybe even be considered a Hellenistic kingdom, was his argument.
That's a hell of an argument.
He made an interesting argument. It was based entirely. He's actually a mixture of a historian and an archaeologist. I want to have him on the channel to actually talk about that. I hope that he will be. In fact, some of the places we're talking about, we have two postdocs here. Another one who studies Greeks in India, and so I'd love to have her on as well, and maybe make them my first two in-person interviews when I move in that direction later this year. And so because it would be amazing to try to show the what people don't normally see, right? And so you don't see this stuff and how impressive it is and how culturally interconnected it is, but it still has its own identity, of course, right? And so that's key.
It is key, and it then becomes interesting because what you see at somewhere like Aksum is the wider cultural importance put on things like the Greek language, which we see around the Mediterranean and around even into parts of India. The cultural importance put on the Greek language wanes during the sort of growth of Aksum, where it actually kind of times in with. So the Aksumite sort of golden era, if you want to think of it like that, is around the time that the Roman Empire is kind of falling apart. And I just find this chronologically fascinating. So we have an ancient kingdom that is reaching its height at the point where in European tradition, the ancient world is ending. So this ancient kingdom of Aksum is interacting with emperors from Rome. The Western Empire falls, breaks apart. And then we see the same kingdom of Aksum trading and sending goods to Britain that appear in Anglo-Saxon burials. So it's this continuity. So I actually make the argument that the ancient world doesn't end in Europe, it ends in Aksum. It ends in Ethiopia. Because that's when we really see the last traditions kind of end. But of course, then Ethiopic history, they carry on a lot of those traditions. So that's kind of a arbitrary distinction as well. But in terms of the way we tell this story, if you're going to tell it the way we do, you've got to end it in Ethiopia, is my argument.
Yeah, I mean, see, this is my issues with narratives, because you try to find an ending and then you realize there isn't a sharp ending. There rarely is, in so many different ways. I had, one of my viral Twitter threads was trying to say that about the Roman Empire in general, because, you have the Byzantine Empire continuing. And so, it's just,
And never goes
these
down
are
well for them.
arbitrary definitions. And they didn't call themselves the Byzantine Empire, guys. They called themselves the Roman Empire, right? And so, these are our own modern ways of categorizing and splitting things up into these different atoms that we put together for our narratives that are all totally biased by how we define these stupid things.
Yeah.
So,
So, I mean, I suppose the job of, in terms of writing this, talking to the public, channels like yours, take it in one direction and really kind of deconstruct all this. And it's fantastic. And those who want that level of detail. But for a lot of people, these narratives are safe and they are comforting. Something my book tries to do is go, okay, you can keep that construct. Like, I'm not dismantling that right now. But let's really stretch it and see what we're actually talking about and what else is going on. And I think there is actually an appetite for that.
No, I agree. And I think you do a great job. This was what a main question I wanted to ask you, even, was kind of like, it's a tricky thing to do in your spot, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to write for the public with this book and expand their understanding of the Egyptian, Roman, Greek, etc. worlds, the ancient world, if you will.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to almost hold their hands, because you start off with a Roman story with Ovid, for example, in his exile. And so, and even your prehistoric section, while it starts off at the Lake Turkana, where you have Turkana Boy and stuff like that, you even introduce deep prehistory with that. Very quickly by the end, we're now in Egyptian history and on the edges of it. And so, it's interesting how you approach that. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because obviously walking to the edges from the center already creates this kind of biased perspective, if you see what I mean, of these regions. And at the same time, you're almost assuming that a reader is going to already have a decent understanding of that core, right? And so it's an interesting tightrope, let's say. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on how to straddle that tightrope of presenting this to the public in an accessible and understandable way to expand their horizons, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm a firm believer in stories as a way of educating. So at my core, I'm an educator. I love teaching people. I mean, it's why it's my job. I love to do it. And when came to something like a book like this, what I was interested in is, where do I want the conversation to go about history and about ancient history and about the ancient world? Where do I think most readers are, roughly speaking, in terms of their general knowledge about the ancient world? And what's the next logical stepping stone? So it would be very easy to try and write a book that did the big leap to what I think we should be talking about, which is some of the things we've already kind of talked about here, about these kind of bigger questions, and actually we should get rid of all these kind of labels. But ultimately,
well, I don't know if we should get rid of them, but we should nuance them, because they're still good heuristics.
Nuance them, Flint. Nuance them, Flint. Academic ease. We're going to nuance them.
Dude, but that's the reality. People think that history is just set in stone with these lines.
Agreed.
But those lines are also useful to think with. That's why you do it, right? And to produce a good book. So that's nuancing them. Don't give me that crap, Owen.
No, I think you are right. I think you are right. It's exactly that. It is about creating, and what you describe as nuance, obviously I describe in this kind of way of expanding and maybe even challenging people's general concepts of what we're talking about here. And I suppose it's about where you're trying to pitch. So I could have written this book for children. It would obviously be written differently. I'd have approached it differently, but thematically, this could be written for children. This could be written for adults. This could be written for university students alone. This could be written for academics. You could write an academic version of this book, and they'd all look completely different.
Yeah.
So it all comes down to one, what you're trying to achieve writing the book, but two, also like how you yourself can engage audiences. So for instance, yourself, Flint, obviously with a channel like this and all the stuff you've done online and in podcasts and things, isn't something that would work for me personally. It doesn't fit with me. It doesn't fit with how I think. It doesn't fit with how I kind of go about my work. And that's not a judgment either way. It is just different ways of communicating, different ways of approaching similar, especially for shared interests we have. It's about approaching the same issues with different direction. And I think that is how we as historians, archaeologists, maximize the number of people we hit.
I fully agree. I think a maximum overload, if you will, flood the space with the various perspectives we have is key.
Yeah.
And because we each have very different perspectives. You coming at it historically, me coming at it archaeologically, you coming at it even from that sort of grand military type tradition, let's
Mhm.
say, and then me, I write and research mostly people's daily lives, right? And so it's very, very different even in these ways. I'm American, you're British. So, there's
I thought you
room for
sounded odd.
but that's key. I think the best way to hit people in general is to come at them from a variety of different perspectives, because the people who are listening or watching or reading are all coming at it from different perspectives as well. And
Yeah,
so there's no
absolutely.
one right way to go about this.
No, there's
Yeah.
not. And there is the narrative approach, the storytelling approach, I think people find easily relatable. If you can tell the stories of individual, it's the reason I loved writing about. There's a Greco-Roman village in Egypt called Karanis,
Mhm.
which has an amazing sort of assortment of papyri that survived, and it is filled with we have almost like archives from family houses. So we've got like documents and contracts and all these things, some of them horrifically mundane. As a historian, as a demographer, like their value is just it's worth more than anything else in the world. I was talking to one demographer about it. She was saying, her name's April Pudsey. She was saying, in terms of the record and the information at places like Karanis and sort of the Fayum Oasis in Egypt, the kind of census records that exist from the Roman period, the amount of information you can garner from that is unmatched until like in Britain, like so 16th, 17th century. It's just a phenomenal resource to understand, as you kind of put it, normal everyday life. And of normal people. So writing that was just amazing, because there's just so many individual little
Different
stories you want
stories.
to tell.
Yeah.
Because it's like, look at this, look at that, look at what's going on over here, look at this young orphan girl taking two men to court, or basically accusing them of stealing from her. Look at the kind of autonomy that seems to be on play here, and the power of what is a young girl, which traditional history tells us she shouldn't have. You've got veterans. You mentioned the military background. I did sneak some in. You've got military history background, that is. You've got veterans who are moaning that they're being beaten, which is against law. If you're a veteran, you are exempt from being beaten as a punishment. So if we read the information from the center, from Rome, we would think veterans don't get punished in these certain ways. You go to Egypt and we suddenly realize life doesn't really work like that. So again, it kind of counters these larger narratives culturally as well.
Yeah, and that's why Egypt is always so interesting, because we have those kind of documents that we occasionally get them elsewhere. You have like those wax tablets from in Pompeii. You have the Vindolanda tablets
Vindolanda
from the
tablets, yeah.
UK. You have occasionally decent preservation in various places, but with Egypt we have so much of it. And starting in the Egyptian periods, going down through the Roman periods,
Yeah.
and so it gives you one of the big debates I remember learning about, because I took papyrology as a grad student, and so one of the big questions is how representative is this rich collection of how the economy or whatever works elsewhere in Rome. And I mean, it's one of those things you could argue about endlessly because
Yeah,
we just don't have as much evidence elsewhere. But it does give you a sense that, yeah, those central narratives that come out of not just modern narratives, they come out of ancient
yeah,
historians who write these central narratives, back in Roman times. They're very much, a narrative that has exceptions to it, and a plethora
absolutely.
of exceptions.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. What else do you want to talk about with the book, or do you want to move on to Bad Ancient?
I'd love to get onto Bad Ancient. I mean, the sort of the last thing with the book, which really struck me again from a historical background, from an archaeological background, it will be very much like, yeah, that is true. It's interesting, isn't it? But from a historical background, you're like, we just don't talk about this enough, which
Mhm.
actually isn't true over the last 10 odd years. In
Yeah.
academic circles, it's being talked about more, and it's just how interconnected the ancient world was via trade.
Mhm. Mhm.
And of course, it doesn't mean these cultures, all these people know about the people at the end of this sort of trade network. And the Romans talk about, their own trade network in some details, all the way through the Red Sea and to the Indian Ocean. There's even vague allusions to beyond the Gulf of Thailand as well.
Mhm.
And something that came up numerous times was like a archaeological site in which they have found items that you can locate pretty much to northwestern Europe, maybe even as far as Cornwall.
Huh.
And in the same site, we have things that you can locate from Indonesia or Southeast Asia, and they're all in one place. And it's just this amazing snapshot of a world that is more connected than perhaps our histories talk about or even
Yeah, it's
aware of.
something it's something that I certainly only first encountered as an undergrad,
Mm.
when reading this book right here, The Corrupting Sea,
Mhm.
by Horton and Purcell. And I think we read it. I was sitting in on a grad class and we read it. It was my last year of undergrad, and we read it right when it came out, right? And so it was just kind of like mind blowing, because that's the entire point of that book, is
Yeah.
just how interconnected everything is or was. And this has been, the trend started before that. It started with Ferdinand Brodel thinking about kind of medieval history
Yeah.
and realizing kind of this, we now sometimes call it global antiquity or global Middle Ages. I
Mm.
think it wasn't called that back then, but today we're starting to think of
Yeah.
it in that way. Which your book is obviously a great example of global antiquity.
Yeah, precisely.
I should put you in touch with the people at Northwestern University, because I just gave a lecture for their global antiquity series. Mine was on
Oh, wow.
pseudo-archaeology, but it would totally fit in with your book as well,
Mm.
because they have a whole series about global antiquity and this, the point about all this
Mm.
interconnection. And so, today it started to trickle down to much more public books. So yours is an example. I had a conversation on the channel with Eric Klein. A lot of his
Yep.
research has been about the interconnectivity in the Bronze Age, and
Yep.
of course how that disruption in interconnectivity impacts the collapse and end of the Bronze Age. And so, and I've even written Twitter threads on sort of the archaeology of Africa and sort of like, Great Zimbabwe,
Yep.
in the very southern Africa, and how they have imports from, from Europe, from Asia,
Yeah.
from region. I think they had imports even from China, all the way in Zimbabwe at that point. And so we need to totally reconceptualize our picture of the past. We really have this picture of the past as these different cultures that, with different languages and customs, and they just didn't mingle and engage with one another. And the reality is, no, it's far more interconnected
Yeah.
than we are taught as children through this mythical picture of history. And yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's I'm glad you picked that up, because that is literally the thread throughout the entire book. So because it is exactly that. Going back to what I said earlier, we talk about civilizations as silos. And if they ever interconnect, it's usually military or power based. Whereas, and I'm not saying that isn't sometimes true. I'm not saying, Rome did expand very fast and it did it with a very efficient army. But it's not the only way these cultures are interacting. It's not the only way the world is being connected together. So yeah, I completely agree. And the move to look at a more global approach comes with limitations, but from this perspective, I think will dispel a lot of misconceptions. And
Yeah.
that, as we kind of started with, is yours and my bread and butter. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and yeah, okay, let's do that then, because that's actually what I talked to you about, how I could see how this book grew out of that bad ancient uh,
Mm.
project that you have, because that's actually a lot of the point of this, is that our picture of ancient history is bad ancient, if you see what I mean. It
Yes.
is very much just focused on these core places and core figures, even historical figures, at the expense of what was really happening, which is that it's far more complex. Just to give an example, because I thought of it while you were talking earlier, is you mentioned how the Greeks were like, wow, is Britain even real? Right? But the Eastern Mediterranean had been importing tin from Cornwall for like several thousand years
Yeah.
before that, maybe 1,000 years before that, or something like that. And so it's like, of course, they might not have known that because it's down the line trade.
Yep.
And so it's not like they end up with some British person there, though they probably had British people there, but they didn't make it into the history books. And so these days we can really get that nuance with scientific tests on metals and bones, even, and teeth and whatnot. But yeah, it's really, that was something that I thought was amazing, was it's really, especially, you oftentimes come at things with your research from the core, but this is in many ways trying to address the ultimate bad ancient
Yeah.
misconception.
Yeah. And it's one of those where yeah, no, I would agree with you about the bad ancient label. But it's not that this is not pseudo history. Okay,
No,
it's
no,
not
no.
fake history.
It's
So exactly like you said, it's a
history of
focus.
blinders on.
Yeah, it's a filter, isn't it?
Yeah.
These cities were important. They exist within our history for a reason. The amount of evidence they have is the reason why they're often the focal point. The reason why we talk so much about the Romans through the perspective of the Romans themselves is because we have so much of their work surviving for various reasons. Same with the Greeks. They dominate for a reason, but that reason isn't necessarily their superiority. It is a survival bias and things like that. So we are thinking about this more as sort of if we're only looking at it from a narrow perspective, what we have there is the buildup of a lot of misconception because of the assumption that, let's make up a number, Flint, 5%. We're looking at 5% of what's going on and thinking that's everything. So I gave you the example of the young girl in Egypt who's doing things that, seemingly young girls shouldn't be able to do in the ancient world, Also in Egypt, we have evidence of women living alone in all female households and things like this. And again, the story we get from the Roman Empire and things like that is you need a male guardian. There must be men involved. Men are everywhere. And that is true, but it can also not be true. And, that is that murkiness of life. It is that the reality of chaos, really. Everyday life is chaotic. It is the idea of Greeks don't like barbarians except when they're marrying them and living with them and living next to them, and it's just, I'm going to use your word, Flint, it's nuancing. It's nuancing something that, but at the same time not saying that Plato or Livy or whoever are liars and they're wrong. They are giving a perspective, and we need to accept that that is a perspective and that there are others that we can actually find and articulate and tell the stories of to show that there are other things going on and that it's not all black and white and as simple as this. And that it's equally as enjoyable, Flint. That would be my argument as well. This isn't just about education. These are fun stories. These are fun events. These are fun facts. And, the evidence is fascinating. And I think history lovers are fascinated by any history that is interesting. It's as simple as that. They find history interesting. So why don't we broaden that and move away at the same time from this narrow focus that's creating misconceptions?
Yeah, no, I agree. The only thing I disagree with you is your point about 5%, because I think what
Do you want
that
less?
is, no, I think what it is we actually, it's the bias of history versus physical evidence. Because well, it's true, because while we look, archaeologically speaking, we have stuff from all over,
Yeah.
right? we have stuff from the edges and the core, and we have
Yep.
a lot from each of those places. Historically speaking, on the other hand, only 5% of our stuff comes from the edges, if you see what I
Yep.
mean. And so it's that, I don't know, it's that desire to create a narrative out of something that's already verbal, if you see what I mean, that's narrative.
Yeah.
And so that has biased us, therefore, towards prioritizing that kind of evidence, and,
Yeah, I
and
can
and
see
how
that.
we tell our stories. Because, I think that there's been less of this emphasis. It still exists, of course, but less of this emphasis in terms of the research that's done archaeologically, is what I mean.
Mhm.
Obviously, within the public imagination and how we teach it, because archaeology is so often taught as a handmaiden of history,
Yep.
it is therefore shoehorned into what the historical evidence says. But excavations have been going on in Afghanistan and India,
Yeah.
and throughout Africa and throughout Britain and whatnot. Like, we probably have more, almost as much Roman evidence in Britain as we do in Italy, if you see what I mean,
Yeah.
because there has been such systematic intent to excavate everything in the UK for a long time as well,
Yeah.
not just more recently, when laws were tightened in Italy, or say in the 20th century.
Mhm.
And so I think we've had this kind of issue because of the evidence we want to use to tell these stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And so this is it, isn't it? So the historical traditions that already exist are obviously built on those narratives. So this kind of comes back to something we were talking about earlier in this chat about different approaches and different angles at the same problem. So as you kind of gather from the history background, my approach is to engage with the narratives we are telling and seeing from that perspective, okay, how can we broaden this?
yeah,
The more archaeological perspective, I completely respect and completely understand. And I think you're right in terms of the biases, but you'd end up writing a very different book.
of
Does that make
course. Oh
sense?
yeah, it would be very different, and it would be, and so that's sort of what Raven did in the book The Other
Yeah,
Civilizations. She took a much more archaeological
yeah,
perspective, and she wasn't focused on just the ancient world. So she went all over, but it was actually similar to yours in a sense, where, and that's what I found interesting, was reading yours, comparing it to hers, because I did that interview not that long
mhm,
ago, and we're publishing it soon. So I was thinking how you both took the case study approach, jumping from place
yeah,
to place, and you both took the perspective of, you want to tell these human stories. So she did that as well, where she took a few real stories when there were historical sources, but in other cases she wrote a fictional story about a character to start the chapter. And so it was, again,
mm,
trying to get at what are these personal stories, to because that's, like you said, people vibe with personal
yeah, they do.
stories. And so, part of my goal while writing a book for the general public is to also include personal stories, though some of them are personal stories about people from the past, some of them are personal stories from my own experience as well, to try to
Mhm.
get that, I don't know, to get that hook in, let's say, of looking at it through my own eyes.
Yeah,
And so I think that storytelling is really, really important to connect with people, because people vibe with stories. It makes sense with
yeah, they
how we
do.
understand
And
the world.
I think also you got to appreciate why people want to consume history
Hmm.
or the stories of the past, and it is that human element and the association of a sense of where we've come from, or where what once was, and the kind of stories we like, the otherness of other historical periods, but we also like that some things always feel familiar. One of my favorite examples of this is, again, an Egyptian papyrus, and it's a letter from the young lad. I think he's called Theon, and it's to his dad. And his dad's gone to Alexandria on a trip,
Hmm. Hmm.
and the letter is basically the young son berating his dad for not taking him. He's like, "How dare you go? It's completely unfair." And he even ends it with like, "I will not eat. I will not sleep. You have ruined this for me. I just want to die." And he just sounds like a teenager having one of those moments. And the historian in me goes, of course, that it's not the same. There's different cultural backgrounds, there's different parameters, different dynamics in families and things like that. But the dad in me sees that and goes, oh, I feel for him.
I mean, I think that's our goal as educators and as public communicators as well, is to try to show how people in the past are similar to us, but also different. Because that again is that nuance, that nasty word, but that's the reality. They're not all different from us completely, but they're also not all the same to us completely. And so I think it's about constantly presenting both the similarities and the differences so that our audience and our students can have that enriched perspective on people in the past and also hopefully apply to people today, right?
Yeah, well, that's always the hope, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, you got to ask the question: what is the point of constantly studying and pushing our knowledge of history from a purely cultural perspective? Like, well, what does it benefit any of us to do this? And I think a lot of that is exactly what you're just saying. It's actually, what can we take with this? What can we learn from this about human interaction, about human development, about cultural development, about cultural shifts and changes, and actually embed that into the way we see the world around us now. Or at least try and learn some of those lessons or bring those conversations in. I'm not a firm believer in learning from history as a hardcore purpose of history as such, because of course the question is, well, what you learn is what you decide you want to learn. So you can read about the Roman Empire and learn how to forge an empire. You read about the Roman Empire and learn how to resist an empire. You learn what you want from it. So I think
I think it's inevitable that we're going to learn from the past. I think all of our own decisions, whether personal or professional or otherwise, are informed by our own experiences and learning of the past. It could just be our learning of how scientists did certain experiments. That tells us about science, right? Or politicians, I think they need to, in my mind, they should have a sense of history, because it gives you a sense of perspective on the potential impacts the decision can have on people. On people. And so, but that said, I don't think there's ever a one-to-one correspondence, because history does not repeat directly. Instead, what you're doing is you're getting perspective and context to understand different realms of possibilities and how things could play out in various ways. And so I think that we need to embrace that people learn from history, but it's never some one-to-one correlation, if you see what I mean. You're never going to find that perfect parallel.
Every time this conversation comes up, Flint, I always have in the back of my mind, not that long ago, we had a qualified classicist as our prime minister.
I was here. I've lived through what, 3
Were you here for that?
Yeah, right at the end of his time. Yeah.
So that's Boris Johnson, for anyone who doesn't know the in and outs of our Etonian prime ministerial parade. Boris Johnson, he got his degree in classics. He is for one of his endorsement of the Oxford Classical Dictionary sits on their website. He is he was at one point, other than Marybeard, possibly the most famous classicist in Britain. Whilst not an academic, obviously he's a politician and he was a journalist. So yeah, that's always in the back of my mind whenever these conversations. And he's often the example I think of when I think, yes, you can learn from history. Of course you can learn from history. But my question is, what are you learning?
Yes, and that's where I agree with you. I think everybody's learning different things, and I think our goal as educators is to try to make sure people can critically read history.
Yeah.
So to recognize how some of the narratives that exist are simplified or there's other perspectives on them. And I think it's the same thing about teaching science. Science is not solid. Science is something that's always in flux, and it's a conversation and a discourse. And so history itself is always a conversation about the past. And we're always learning more and asking new questions and finding new evidence and developing new methods. It's not set in stone. But at the same time, we need to recognize that all our decisions do come from our own past experience and what we learn about history. And so in the end, that is what frames things. And so we have no choice but to embrace that. But of course, everybody's going to take their own lessons in different ways. And that's just life. I'm not a parent, but I imagine that parents have that same issue with children as they grow up. Well, they're going to make their own decisions and their own sometimes mistakes, and that is that, or what you view as a mistake, let's say, as a parent. And so that's just kind of life. We're not, but at the same time, I think history, therefore, is extremely important and essential. And to cut it, for example, as is happening here in Cardiff with ancient history, that is extremely short-sighted, because I think it would be better, since everybody's learning from history anyway, if they learned history from real ancient historians who are doing this stuff, to get that perspective. Even if they'll take it in whatever direction, the humanities are not a fucking salve to heal all wounds in a society. That's not what it is. But they still need to be there, because that's valuable, because because otherwise they might be learning real fake history, bad ancient type stuff, rather than what actually happened.
It's exactly that. I completely agree with you, and I think it's not just the history is taught in this country. For most people, their interaction with history occurs at school, and then if they decide to take it to the sort of A level point, to that's the 18-year-old up to the age of 18 in compulsory school education. The numbers in universities is it's pretty solid in terms of recruitment, but it's not everyone. So if you think of when historical education ends for most people, and then they take on their own, so then the reading of the books, the watching of the videos and the podcasts and all this thing, history in many people's minds is still factual.
Yeah.
And it's still black and white, and it's still, well, this is what happened, and that's the date. So 410 is when the Romans left Britain. That's a fact. The archaeologist in the room has a chuckle. But, this is what we're taught. And if you don't push that further, that kind of sticks with you. And you can't blame anyone for that. It's no one's fault. But on the same token, history is, like you said, it's about asking questions. I mean, literally, historia, inquiry, is the meaning of the word history.
And that's how you start your book, by saying that's your definition of history and prehistory, is that inquiry, right? You're asking questions.
Yeah, it's precisely that, is the inquisitiveness. And of course, the famous example, the one that everyone always points to, is Herodotus of Halicarnassus, the so-called father of history. And he asks these questions. I mean, he's probing. So he's not talking about the entire history of Greece in this period he's looking at. He's not even talking about the history of the Persian Empire or anything like that. He's asking questions, specific questions, and he's trying to answer them. One of the things I really like about Herodotus is he's really open about stuff where there's conflicting evidence. And he's also very open, going, well, I kind of prefer this version, but I'm going to tell you the rest of them as well. Yeah. And I just think there's a real honesty to that. And it's more in traditions of almost more like folklore traditions, rather than what you and I might think of as almost conventional history as it's done now, which is usually considered part of the Thucydides tradition, the Greek historian who kind of takes over from Herodotus. Although interestingly, I was talking to who was I listening to? Professor Neville Morley, absolutely brilliant scholar of Thucydidean scholarship, and it was something he said, which was Thucydides never calls his work a history.
Yeah,
he never uses the word.
Interesting.
And I just find that fascinating.
And I mean, sharp delineations are tough as well, because I mean, Herodotus does work off of some primary sources here and there.
He does, yeah.
And a lot of it is folk traditions or stories and whatnot. And then he says, I like this story better than that one. But some of it, he talks about actual documents and inscriptions that he saw. And or
the very dodgy description of a hippopotamus as well.
Yes. He definitely has some dodgy descriptions for sure too.
So yeah,
and some of the crazy ones have been proved right. Like I saw some people talking about narcotics in the chat, and he talks about the Scythians and how they smoked marijuana. And we have really good archaeological evidence for that. We have burials full of cauldrons with carbonized hemp seeds. And so, it's like, so even though it seems like, oh yeah, and he even describes it in this hokey way where he's like, they take these smoke showers in like tents, and then they shriek and howl with laughter, is the translation I remember. And it's just like, so it sounds all hokey and everything, but there actually is pretty good evidence, solid archaeological evidence that justifies that kind of ish description, let's say.
Yeah. Well, this is it. So you still got to take these things with a pinch of salt. But what the combination of the archaeology with the written evidence means that you can go, well, we no longer need to dismiss him out of hand. So we've still got to deal with it gently. We've still got to work out what he might or might not have known about, seen about, heard about. When is he obviously being sold a tall tale, and when is he trying to report something that might be true? But we don't just have to dismiss him because it's Herodotus, and there was a long tradition of that being the case.
It's called the father of lies sometimes.
Yeah, exactly that. Father of history and the father of lies. Makes you wonder what that meant history was. But the point here is, I like my book, the way I visualize my book, the way I visualize my work is I'm question driven. Like naturally, I'm question driven. I'm not answer driven. I'm question driven. If I get an answer, I've got 3 more questions. That's how I am. So that's the kind of historical tradition I would place my book. It's the more Herodotean tradition of let's ask questions, let's ask more questions, let's use questions to understand the world. Once you've got sort of an idea, or dare I say a narrative of this, now let's ask a different question and see how it changes it. And I think this is why I've been doing a lot of interviews at the moment, Flint. I had another one in which I mentioned I was asked by basically, is this all cutting edge new research? I went, no, archaeology has been saying this for decades. But historians haven't been asking the right questions to get to it.
I find that funny. Like, it was something that I saw happen after I was on Joe Rogan presenting this research. And there's this assumption somewhere that when we write for the public that we're presenting cutting edge stuff, but that's almost never the case. There's very rarely a situation where an archaeologist or a historian who's writing a book for the public, most of what we're doing is summarizing consensus and putting our own spin on it, and to make it into an interesting narrative for the public. And I mean, I really can't think of almost any general public books where it's actually presenting some sort of cutting edge new thing.
No, it's
and so
arguments, cutting edge arguments. I'm thinking of the dawn of everything kind of builds on admittedly still builds on arguments that have been going on quite a while.
It still builds on arguments that have been going on for decades. I mean, it's an interesting book. I got to reach out to David Wengro and see if he'd be willing to come on the channel and talk about it. But I mean, I certainly would not. I mean, it's cutting edge for the public, without a doubt. It was certainly trying to throw on the heels this idea of civilization in a sense, and how it started, and that kind of jazz, and how it developed, let's say. But God, these arguments about heterarchy even versus hierarchy, they've been going on since the 80s at the least. I mean, I remember reading about that stuff from theoretical archaeological theory articles from the 80s. And so, just in terms of and the specific cultures that they covered in there, most of it was not their own research. It was summarizing research that had been done by
building
others,
on the research of others,
and who had already made these points that these were not extremely hierarchical cultures. And so, I mean, I think that it was heralded as a great book for many good reasons, but it certainly was not cutting edge in terms of academic scholarship, if you see what I mean. There were conversations that were already, I was taught them as grad students 10 years ago or more, and so, 15
years ago. I'm not as bold as you, so I won't say how many years ago, but years ago, I was after my master's, I set up as a freelance writer and historian. So I did a lot of magazine work. That was how I really put food on the table for a long time. And the way I always saw that role, and it's something that's kind of stuck with me ever since, even as I came back into university life and PhDs and so on, was I considered my role to be a translator of scholarship. So how do I translate often quite complicated scholarship and quite in detailed and nitty gritty and filled with jargon and philosophical debates that underpin it, that you need to have a grasp of to even understand what they're writing about. If anyone's sort of read the kind of dense scholarship you get in a journal article, it is an act of translation. And that was kind of how I saw my role writing for the public. I'm going to take the amazing scholarship that's going on and actually try and help communicate it to the public, so they get to see what's going on and get to see what it is. So something I try to do in this book as best I could. Something I've always tried to do is, if you're going to translate the scholarship for the public, you need to translate as close to present day scholarship as possible. Something I've always
You want it to be up
kind
to
of,
date, yeah.
yeah, exactly. Something I always observed years ago was, I always felt like public history, or the history written for the public, was about 20 years behind the scholarship in terms of what it was talking about. So something I've always wanted to do with everything I write, and I've tried to do in this book, is to try and catch up, if that makes sense. And of
No,
course,
of
you can't
course.
do all of it. You can't do
And
everything.
and that's exactly the goal. I think that's my approach as well.
Mm,
Whether I'm chatting here with you, or whether it's the book that I'm writing, or even when I, like when I went on Joe Rogan, my goal
yeah,
was to present an up-to-date picture with, that included articles that had been published just a month earlier.
yeah,
Like that's always my goal, is to weave in the latest things, in addition to, of course, that foundation that I got when I was a student, because that's where it always comes from in the end.
yeah,
And so, and then you as scholars, we get added on by going to conferences and listening to this sort of up-to-date research, so we can anticipate when it's published, and then we know to a certain degree some of the synopsis of what it's going to say, because we've heard somebody talk about it. And so, yeah, and I think that translation is key. And then the second key is, that's what makes it cutting edge. And we're always putting our own spin on it, though.
oh yeah,
And that I guess is the key thing to get across. Like, I rarely present my own research to the public. I do, and I have several times, but
mm,
it can't be the core of what I present, or I couldn't do a podcast every week. It wouldn't be possible. I don't have a new paper coming out every week, right? It just doesn't move that fast.
you're slacking,
And
Flint. You're slacking.
and and then the other issue is that it's not even just that. It's that our research is so embedded in scholarly conversations
Yep.
that to even introduce it is a monumental effort. To introduce why and how it's relevant requires embedding it within, like, at least 20, 30 years of scholarship.
Mm,
And so that makes it really difficult, because, I'm talking about this one site that nobody's ever heard of, but I'm talking about my own research at that site. And then it's in this period of time, in this general region. And so, there's so much legwork that needs to go into that, to sort of give that sort of slow landing, that, hey, here's Ovid in exile, if you see what I mean, because people know who Ovid is because they've read some poetry of him. And so, that's what's so difficult. It's one reason, whenever I go and talk to people about public engagement, I try to say, look, if every single one of us just made a YouTube video a year, we could flood the internet with really good educational materials that would fight back against the misinformation and just general, not ignorance, that's a harsh word, but the general misconceptions about the
yep.
past that are out there. And so, but what I always want to preface that with is, don't make that video about your research, because to do that requires all that legwork. Your research is so embedded in what's going on right now. Instead, take your best teaching lecture and turn that into a YouTube video. Something from an undergrad introductory level module or class, and translate that for the general public, which is much easier to do than to translate your research.
Yep.
And then, boom, we can fill out how we do things with narratives that are oftentimes up to date, because our teaching lectures are also constantly updated with the new research that's coming out, and with case studies that our colleagues are using. And so that's always my advice, is everybody should just take their best teaching lecture, and one a year, and just produce that for the public. And we would flood the internet with really good information that's
Yeah,
accessible and understandable.
indeed. It's a really nice idea. It is just a really nice idea. I'd love to see it happen, Flint.
Yeah, or even articles on blogs, whatever format we want to do it in, like
Do
on
you
Bad
know,
Ancient.
on that,
Yeah.
because for Bad Ancient, we're building a network of history writers, and it's something I spend a lot of time doing. Is basically, we get a question and I go out and try and find people who might be interested in writing it, and the amount of them who I would consider specialized enough to be able to do this task don't feel qualified.
And but then who's qualified,
Well,
right?
this is always my argument, which is, well, unqualified people are talking about it, so you're a bit more qualified than them, aren't you?
Exactly. It's just so silly that they're qualified enough to go get paid to give a lecture on the topic in front of undergrads.
Yeah.
Because I certainly some of these topics here, I have taught ancient sports. I have talked about the Colosseum and naval battles. I've also taught the topography of Rome. So I've taught about the Naumachia and stuff like that there. Again, with ancient sports, I've talked about the Nazis and stuff like that in Olympic Flames. Alexander the Great, that's just basic ancient. You have a lot of sports here, don't you?
It was around the Olympics. Leave me alone.
No, I'm just joking. But I mean, come on, we engage with this stuff all the time. We know where to go get sources, whether it's a textbook that we've used or things like that. And then we also know primary sources and images that we could use to jazz it up. We all have this. Anybody that's brushing you off by saying that they don't feel qualified is either intimidated about talking to the public, which is certainly possible, and they don't want to, put their foot in their mouth and deal with it, and or they're just trying to come up with a polite way to brush you off and say, I don't feel like doing this because I don't have time, which both of these are justifiable things, but we live in a world where we need to be engaging with the public more and more because our departments are being cut. We're seeing these challenges in the political climate and in funding climate and otherwise. If we don't start talking to the public, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot, let alone what is our goal as educators and researchers, if not to disseminate and share this information and make it as accessible as we can. So I feel like we have an ethical need to do this now. That said, our jobs are becoming more difficult. We're becoming paid less to do far more. And so I get that pressure.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so I empathize with that without a doubt. But
yeah, absolutely. But it's also, I mean, it's like you were saying just then, but to take it a step further, we're now entering a period, or we've been in a period of a couple of years now, of open weaponization of the ancient world. Especially on the political level, but we're seeing it in the more public sphere. It doesn't always necessarily just sit in politics, but this weaponization of ancient history makes this a more pertinent issue. And for me, it's all well and good academics talking about it and identifying it and problematizing it. How are we actually engaging with it publicly? And while it may not have obvious links, that's in that conversation is also where I'd sit books like mine and actually going, I'm not telling you the Roman Empire wasn't like that, but what I am telling you is that's a very narrow interpretation of it. Let's look at everything else. In Britain a couple of years ago, we had a bit of a hoo-ha when Mary Beard had the audacity, Dame Professor Mary Beard had the audacity to suggest that there might have been black people in Roman Britain.
Oh my God!
For anyone who is not aware, that is a terrible joke. And there were indeed people of many ethnicities in Britain. In fact, we have we have evidence of Syrian culture here before we have supposedly Anglo-Saxon culture here. So that's the reality of Britain in the Roman Empire. But she was torn apart publicly by people.
This is Twitter for you.
This is Twitter, but there was also newspapers, conversations, and op-eds and things like this.
That's being a real celebrity like Mary Beard for you. Yeah.
Well, precisely. She is the figurehead in Britain of classics and of this sort of traditional ancient history. Like, it is Mary Beard. There is no one greater than Mary Beard, and she gets a lot of this regularly. I have nothing but sympathy for her as a result. But it's from just such a narrow perspective. My understanding of Romans is, Romans in Britain means Romans from Italy. Yeah, that's the perception. And you got someone with the kind of the gravitas and the qualifications, dare I say, of Mary Beard going, well, no, the Roman Empire, the empire, all of it. There's a lot of it. These are a lot of different people. And it causes a big kerfuffle every time.
It's absurd. I mean, anytime, and look, that's just a function of the world we live in. Anytime you bring up race in any way, or skin color, let's say, it's just people are gonna go nuts because they have these preconceptions,
Mm.
and those preconceptions cannot be challenged because even just bringing up race somehow means you're chastising them or
Yep.
something. And it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you, but the ancient world was complex and nuanced, and people intermingled and moved around fairly regularly, and we can detect this quite clearly through various pieces of evidence. For example, the strontium signatures in people's
Yep.
teeth. Or there's an example in Britain of in a what am I trying to say? In a toilet deposit, literally, there's evidence of a parasite from a fish that could only have originated in the Black Sea, and it could not have originated from a fish that was processed and salted. So therefore, that person came from the Black Sea with that parasite, and then took a dump in wherever, I forget the name of the site, in this midden in Britain. And so
You
that's
got
someone
so
with
close to
really
sounding very academic through all of that. Very professional, Flint, and then boom.
and so we have this direct evidence. We have, God, I think wasn't there around the time of that kerfuffle some DNA evidence of somebody in Britain, Roman Britain, from East Asian
Yes, in
population?
London.
Yeah. And so, like we have so many different proxies, from DNA to geological signatures in your teeth to the parasites that you can have that
Mm.
show just how far people move. And this is not just the goods like the
Yeah.
tin from Cornwall. These are people moving. And so, and then we have textual evidence from like Vindolanda and elsewhere
Yep.
of people and where they come from. And so, we have all these different competing evidence that show how much people move around. Yeah. So wait, I want to know how long you want to keep going. Should we take some questions from the audience? What do you feel
Take
like
some
doing?
questions.
Okay.
Like I said, my ADHD is kicking in. So
Okay. But if you want to stop, just tell me.
new
That's fine
voices.
too. Here, wait, let me put up. I have like first of all, boom, let's put up a banner and then a note
Love
because
it.
this is what I can do. I'm all professional now.
I'm very impressed with this software.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice. And yeah. It costs the same as a Zoom subscription. So I ditched
Hmm.
Zoom and I went to this, and yeah, it's much nicer. So okay, so yeah, if anyone has some questions for Owen, I thought I saw some questions up above, but now I'm lost on the chat. There's too many different things in here. Do stories of giants count as advanced civilizations?
They're just trolling you now, Flint.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think someone had asked, where does this idea of an advanced civilization come from? And like in many ways, it comes from kind of really, I would say it comes from Francis fucking Bacon, to be honest. Seriously,
Yeah, I
Francis
can see
Bacon
that.
wrote The New Atlantis, and it was a fiction book, but in it he presented this idea of Atlantis, of having this advanced technology where people survived and then they sort of hid
Mm.
from the world as it developed. And that fiction book ended up becoming pseudo nonfiction, and that's how we have this idea in many ways, because Atlantis in Plato's perception did not have advanced technology.
Yeah.
It was just a cool Greek city state in a sense.
Yeah.
And so yeah,
Well,
okay, so we
what
have
we do have in the ancient record is Herodotus in particular seems interested not in advanced civilizations, but who's the oldest.
Yes.
So it's
Yeah,
the
and
idea of
Plato sort of
legitimacy
talks.
through age.
Yeah, Plato talks about that a little bit with Egypt and stuff like
Mm.
that. So yeah, there are some discussions, but I mean, what I find funny, I'm going to bring this up in some future video, is because I've been writing on Egypt lately, and like the pyramids, people are like, advanced technology, they couldn't have done it, and it's like, if this was so advanced, then why did like Herodotus not think it was so advanced? He
Mm.
writes about it as if they were just using levers and ramps. He's like, of course that humans could have done this with technology, So like, if it was so advanced that like it was that impressive, well then why would the ancient Greeks and Romans like Pliny and Herodotus think, yeah, we could think through how people did
Yeah.
this?
Sure.
They saw it as a very doable venture with Iron Age technology. what the hell? It's not like Bronze Age technology is going to be so much different. We know that the Egyptians were carving blocks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we have some questions for you though. So did you cover the Carthaginians' voyages and mysteries related to the disappearance of their record? So anything on Carthage?
The Carthaginians do come up. They do come up partly because of the idea of spreading the edge of the world is sort of the edge of a cultural sphere's knowledge of the world. And the Carthaginians and the Greek voyagers who follow them were sort of pivotal to pushing those boundaries out. Yeah, so what was a fictional land suddenly becomes a known land. And I absolutely love the stories. I'm obsessed with the stories of the circumnavigation of Africa by the Carthaginians. And, did it happen? Did it not happen? Can we dismiss it? Can we not dismiss it? There's also, I think it's Hanos, who only comes around the west coast of Africa, who goes around the west coast of Africa. I'm pretty sure it's Hano's account that talks about meeting a tribe in what might have been Senegal or around that kind of region, maybe, called the Gorillai. And historians often like to say, he saw gorillas. But ultimately, that's not what he says. They're very much human. But that story influenced the much later scientists who first look at the specimens of these large apes, and it's that story that comes to them that gives the name gorilla. So it is, it is linked, but not necessarily because he saw gorillas. It might just be linked by this later tradition who liked that story and made that link themselves. So yeah, the Carthaginians definitely come up because they're also particularly important in understanding Northwest Africa during the Ptolemaic period. So you get, we mentioned Cleopatra, but Cleopatra's daughter goes west and rules there with her husband and then has a son. So the Ptolemies don't end in Egypt. They end in basically like Morocco. And Punic culture is just as important as the Greek culture, as the Roman culture and everything else that's going on there. And there's also what you and I might think of as Berber culture as well at the same time. So it's a beautiful microcosm of the whole point of the book, which is just look at all these cultures blending together and creating a normal world and a normal life for these people in these areas. So yeah, the Carthaginians do come up. Absolutely. They are just fascinating, but again, frustrated by the lack of evidence we have from them.
Yeah, their records. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Another question. I'm not sure if you've read it or not. What do you think about Jack Goody's The Theft of History?
Oh, not read it. Not read it. Is it one you know, Flint?
No, I've not read it either. I've read other stuff by Goody, but not this book.
Well, I'm going to have to go read it.
I have no answer. A simple one, I suppose. Any chances of the book being translated to other languages?
Yes. So it is being translated into American English. I think it's about October. It should be out. But it's also being translated into Spanish, Italian, German, Dutch, Greek, and Russian at the moment. Those are the translation rights that have been sold so far.
Great. Yeah, that's fantastic. So
I hope one of those is relevant.
Your thoughts on the Ptolemy world map and what cool things what cool thing it can tell us about the ancient past?
Could you get a copy of my book up?
Yeah.
Because that is a stylized version of a bit of the Ptolemy world map.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So it is just a fantastic map. We have no ancient versions of it. So if you ever see a stylized picture of it, you're seeing usually post sort of 1500s AD, Common Era. I mean, the Ptolemy world map is just amazing. It's the reason why I mentioned earlier about we have evidence of Romans understanding their trade network went into Southeast Asia. And the Ptolemy world map is kind of one of those core bits of evidence. And is Ptolemy's desire to try and give the measurements and the distances between places allows modern researchers to really kind of go, okay, so actually he seems to now have gone beyond the Gulf of Thailand. And he mentions a place called Katagara in Southeast Asia somewhere. And because of the amount of detail he gives, many scholars think he might be talking about a Vietnamese site called Archaeology. And that's because of works like his. So ridiculously important to understand the ancient world and how the Romans or the Greeks or these traditions saw it. Also interesting because the Ptolemaic map is also influential for centuries afterwards.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
it strongly influenced even the maps that people like Christopher Columbus were using and people's conception of the world. You'll notice in that picture, you've got this kind of land mass that goes all the way along as if it's creating a circle. And you've got, I mean, you'll have come across this with all the Atlantis stuff, the idea of this southern continent. The ancient maps, the ancient descriptions of the world have it because they're not quite sure basically what the world looks like. There's a whole argument. Is there an ocean that goes around all the land masses? Is there a land mass at the bottom? Is there a mirror image of north and south in the hemispheres? They're dabbling with all these ideas. And today, some of those ideas are being resurrected in what Flint and I would refer to as pseudo history, you know, these kind of conspiratorial things. Often what they're drawing on are really ancient traditions that we now know aren't true or aren't correct. And it's, I think sometimes we forget people like Ptolemy are using the information they have and then speculating, because that is more useful than just going, I don't know, so I won't do it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, that's what we all sort of do anyway. That's how we learn from history in many ways. We say, oh, this thing happened in the past. Let's speculate about how it could impact us in the future. If you see what I mean? It's true. That's human nature, is
It
to
is
try to
human
do
nature. I
that
think
kind of
you're right.
speculation. And it's how we look. Sometimes we just have to make a decision. Another question, though I wanted to end it because we had this up, but do you cover anything revealed from the Dead Sea Scrolls?
No, Dead Sea Scrolls don't really come up. I am a horrific follower of tangents, and I struggle to come back in. Some people talk about rabbit holes. I think that's a bit too glamorous for what I do, which is quite chaotic. And the Dead Sea Scrolls would just send me right off. So no, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not come up in this. You want, if you're interested in that sort of thing. I do cover a pre-Israelite site in what is now Israel and ancient Palestine at Megiddo, which has obvious later biblical importance as the site of Armageddon, but nothing to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. No.
Okay, well, this makes sense. I think this is a good place to end it since we have this up. No Dead Sea Scrolls, but all sorts of other fantastic stuff as we discussed.
Far more interesting things, Flint.
Yeah, so check it out. If you're in the UK, I think it comes out tomorrow.
Yep.
If you're in the US, it'll come out in the fall. And make sure, Owen, remind me when it comes out in the US that we boost this conversation again.
I will do.
In the meantime, you can find Dr. Rees and the larger collective of Bad Ancient on badancient.com and check it out. They sort of fact check all sorts of various claims and stuff from the past in the ancient world. It's kind of set up like Snopes, but run by busy academics who just want to share knowledge. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for your support. And I think I'll probably, I should have a video coming out tomorrow. Not critiquing, what's the word? Reviewing Mr. Beast's video in the pyramids in Giza. So you get to see what I have to say about Mr. Beast and his 100 hours at Giza. And hopefully we'll have that out tomorrow, if not Friday, but I'm hoping for tomorrow. And then I might do a gaming this weekend. And then next Tuesday, I have Muthi al-Rashid on to talk about her book, Between Two Rivers. And then I have the Working Classicist Collective to talk about their periodic table of Greek mythology. So we have a packed set of stuff coming up. So tune in to Archaeology with Flint. Thank you very much, everybody.